Namaskar. Now we will be moving on with our next lecture, which is lecture 35 in our course on sales and distribution management, and we shall be continuing with the previous topic, which is management of sales territories. Now, the concepts which we have covered in this particular topic in the previous lecture are the meaning of a sales territory, rationale behind formation of sales territories, procedure for setting up or revising sales territories. Today we shall be moving on further, and we shall be discussing a little more on the procedure, where we shall discuss the build up and the breakdown methods which may be used for setting up or revising sales territories, and then we shall be discussing how do you manage sales territories or the management of sales territories, and how do you assign salespersons on territories, and then we shall be finally discussing the routing and scheduling of sales personnel. So, let us begin with a brief background to the previous lecture, where we said that a sales territory comprises both existing and potential customers who are assigned to a salesperson or to a marketing unit, and we said that this marketing unit could be a salesperson, it could be a dealer, it could be a distributor, and it may or may not be linked to a geographic unit and may or may not have geographic boundaries. The fundamental concept underlying the definition is that a sales territory is made up of customers, be it actual customers or prospective customers, and not the geographic unit. The focal point is the customer, not the geographic area, yet most companies form sales territories and link it to a geographic unit. Of course, we also said that sometimes based on the size of the company, based on the kind of products it is into, the kind of customers that it is taking care of, and the kind of abilities that the salespersons possess, sales territories may also be formed on other basis, but yet in most cases most companies form sales territories and link it with a geographic unit. And we discussed that when we set up sales territories, we start with selecting a basic control unit, which is generally should be the smallest control unit, which smallest geographic unit, could be a state, could be a district, could be a city, could be a town. We also said that while these are all basic units, we should generally go for choosing the smallest unit, because calculating a sales potential in the smallest of units is easier. It is easy to calculate, and also if any changes are required, any revisions are needed while forming territories, they can be easily adjusted. The second point, we said that we need to determine the location and potential in each of the territories, and then third, we said that we come up with a tentative territory design based on the build up method and the breakdown method, and then finally we make adjustments to the territories, keeping in mind the the unique characteristics which territories may possess, keeping in mind the challenges and complexities which may differ from territory to territory, and also keeping in mind the workload or the sales potential that exists in those different territories, because the objective here is to ensure is to equalize workload, is to equalize sales potential. So, while we were doing this, we mentioned in the previous lecture that when you set up or revise sales territories, we use two methods, which is the build up method and the breakdown method. We will first talk a little bit more on the build up method, and then we will come to the breakdown method. Now, we discussed earlier that when we talk of the build up method, it is based on the premise that the workload of salespersons must be equal. Salespeople we have to formulate and build up on the control units, but keep in mind that the workload of salespeople is equalized. We did discuss that salespersons always and always would want equitable distribution of workload, and because if workload is not equitably distributed, it can lead to demotivation among sales force. And so, the build up method is based on this premise that the workload that a salesperson has compared to another must be the same, they must have equal workload. So, how do you go about building a territory based on the build up method? First and foremost, you decide on the call frequencies which are to be made on yearly. So, what are the number of calls, total number of calls which must be made on an annual basis, and then you calculate the customer calls to be made in each control unit. Or here control unit could mean the town or the city or the district, and then you estimate the workload capacity of a salesperson. Now, the workload capacity of a salesperson is calculated by multiplying the average number of calls a salesperson can make in a particular day by the total number of working days in a year. So, this would again this time required for each call again will vary from account to account. It would vary from customer to customer type. It would vary whether it's a service selling or a developmental selling. Service selling means when you are actually selling to existing customers. Developmental selling means when you are selling to to prospects who have not yet become your customers. Also, based on whether you categorize them as A, B or C in terms of the sales and profit potentials, the amount of time that you will have to spend on each call will vary. So, this is something which needs to be taken care of, that while we decide on the call frequencies to be made and when we calculate the customer calls to be made in each control unit, we must also estimate the workload capacity of a salesperson, and the workload capacity of a salesperson would be multiplying the average number of calls that he can make in a day by the total number of working days in a year, and this would also mean that you have to calculate the amount of time that would be required to make calls. So, this would vary from account to account. The next step is to fix tentative territories, and this again involves grouping control units adjacent to each other or neighboring each other, such that the number of calls to be made in the control units in a year equals the number of calls that a salesperson can manage to make, because we are talking about how many working hours does he have, how much of time does he need to spend on each call, and accordingly you have to decide that the number of calls made in a control unit in a year should equal the number of calls that he can actually manage to make. And then after you've fixed the tentative territories, you decide on the final territories, and especially this particular step becomes very relevant and very important when it is realized that adjustments are required because the salesperson's workload is not equal. So, this would mean addition or removal of control units, adjacent control units or neighboring control units, so that the workload for each of the salesperson becomes equalized. So, this is the build up method for deciding on sales territories. You start with the call frequencies to be made yearly, you calculate the number of calls to be made in a control unit, and you estimate the workload capacity of the salesperson, keeping in mind the average number of calls that he can make in a day by multiplying it with the number of working days he has. And then again this would need an adjustment because the time required to make sales call to different categories would vary, and then you fix the tentative territories, and then you decide on the final territories by grouping them, grouping adjacent control units, so that even if you actually combining small control units, adjacent control units, so that the sales territory which ultimately gets derived has an equal workload compared to the next or the other territories. So, this is the build up method. We have another method which we use to decide on the sales territories, and this is the breakdown method. Now, this is based on the premise that the sales potential of territories must be equal. Again, going back, if you remember in the previous lecture we had spoken that sales personnel also desire that they should have equal opportunities for earning sales, which would mean that there must be some kind of equitability with respect to the sales potential of territories. So, what is the majorly to be kept in mind here is the sales potential of territories is equalized, so that everyone has an equal opportunity to generate sales and to earn incentives and rewards. So, how do you go about deciding on sales territories based on the breakdown method? First and foremost, you decide the company's sales potential for the total market, and then you calculate the sales potential for each control unit. The sales potential for each control unit would be calculated by multiplying the total sales potential of the company by the multiple factor buying index of each control unit. So, that will give us the sales potential for each control unit, and then you must estimate the sales volume expected from each salesperson, so that the profit so that ultimately profits can be earned. So, this would be based on the sales, on the costs and the profitability analysis, and thereafter you fix the tentative territories, which would mean that you are grouping control units adjacent to each other or adjoining each other in such a way that the sales potential of each territory equals to or is greater than the sales volume expected from each salesperson. So, you do that to see that the efforts of the salesperson do not go in vain. He has opportunity to sell more and he can actually manage to sell more. So, you will group control units adjacent to each other such that the sales potential of each territory equals to or is greater than the sales volume which can be generated by the salesperson, and then you decide on the final territories. So, this again you may have to decide, or you need to decide on the final territory when you realize that the adjustments are required, because the sales potential in each of the territories is not equal or different selling efforts are required, which would mean that the salesperson has to spend more time, and it would also sometimes happen that there is huge competition, and so the selling method and the selling style that is required is different. So, you decide on the final territories keeping in mind the fact that there must be an equal sales potential, and this would mean addition or removal of control units or adjacent areas till the equal sales potential is realized. So, that ultimately the sales potential in the different territories is same or is equal. Now, after this, what we come to is the management of sales territories. Now, once sales territories have been defined, once they have been formed, the next step is to assign salespersons to those territories. Now, while allotting a particular territory to a salesperson, or while allocating salespersons to their respective territories, sales managers must keep in mind the KSAs of their sales personnel. We have discussed earlier the knowledge, skills and abilities, how important they are, especially in the case of B2B dealings, where it is very important that the knowledge, skills and abilities of salespersons match with the sales job role or with the sales job requirement. Now, if you realize that there is a territory where where there is huge competition, and where the customers prefer changing their vendors very often, in that case it will be very crucial that you assign salespeople, your best sales force there, so that the sales force can make follow-up calls, explain technical details, continue to help the buyers with solving their problems, and also such salespeople who will be able to deal with the problems of the buyers instantly. Technically, they should be very good to handle technical issues, technical problems, so that the buyer gets an instant solution to his problems. Now, in such a case, it would be very wise to have the best of salesperson there, technically qualified, with good interpersonal skills, so that the existing customers or the existing clients can be instantaneously provided with support, and they would understand, they would feel good about the salesperson, about the company, and would like to have continued business rather than switching over to the competitor. So, what I am trying to say here is that you have to understand the requirements with respect to the knowledge, skills, abilities of salesperson across territories, and see which kind of salesperson would fit in which of the territories, so that there can be a good fit, and the company can earn good sales. So, the relative ability of salesperson must be assessed, and this is assessed by identifying relevant or important traits and characteristics, as well as the knowledge, skills and abilities, and assigning weights to these, and to finally arrive at weighted summated scores, which would tell you about the relative ability of a salesperson. And the best of the salesperson should be assigned to territories where there is huge potential, but also competition, or where customers are extremely demanding, or where it is realized that given the right kind of sales force, you will be able to earn new customers or generate new sales. So, in those cases, it's very important that you assign the best of the salespersons there. Also, if there is a territory where there are prospects which are very hot prospects, or there are prospects who are medium prospects, again it would be better to assign the best of salespersons there to be dealing with those and to convert those into actual customers. So, the relative ability of the salespersons must be assessed, and accordingly they must be assigned to the territories, and keeping in mind the requirement of the territory. So, what we are talking of a fit between the KSAs of the salesperson and the job role, as well as the characteristics of the and the requirements of the sales territories. Also, it is important that while you are assigning salespersons to territories, you also have to see the effectiveness of salespersons. Some salespersons are well equipped and very good in handling certain kinds of customers, in handling certain kinds of selling situations, while the others are good at others. So, the effectiveness of salespersons must also be kept in mind, and the effectiveness of salesperson always gets enhanced when there is a match between the salesperson and his territory in terms of similarity of language, culture, customs, traditions. Research has shown that it's whenever there is some kind of socio-cultural similarity between the salesperson and the prospects or the customers, the probability of a sale happening and the probability of customer relationships developing is very, very high. So, while sales territories are formed, salespersons are assigned to territories, and while allocating salespersons to territories, sales managers must keep in mind the knowledge, skills and abilities of their sales personnel, and try to have a good fit between the KSAs and the job requirements and the territory characteristics. They must also look into the effectiveness of salespersons, which often gets enhanced because of socio-cultural similarities. Salesperson should be assigned to territories such that their job requirements matches their KSAs and the relative contribution to the profits can be the highest. So, these are certain things which sales managers must keep in mind while they are assigning their sales force into the various sales territories. The best of salesperson must be sent to territories where there is huge potential, where there is competition, where there is a lot of challenge or when there is a very loyal customer base which must be kept loyal, where there are a lot of complex selling situations may arise, so that the best of salespersons would be able to deal with them. And so, it is important that the relative ability of the salespersons is assessed and the effectiveness of the salesperson is assessed before they are sent to the different territories. Now, a good territory management helps salespersons maximize sales, minimize costs in terms of time, in terms of money, and this would lead to healthy profits. And so, sales managers need to address two very, very important issues, which is routing and scheduling, which we shall be discussing shortly. The manner in which salespersons plan their routes or schedule their sales calls, and the way in which they manage their time for both selling and non-selling activities is a major determinant of profitability. The way salespersons would decide on their routing, which is the travel plans, or scheduling their sales calls, which is more of time management, and the way they manage their time for both selling and non-selling is something which will really have an impact on profitability of an organization. So, routing, scheduling, time management, etc. Also help sales managers exercise closer control over the salesperson's activities and movements, as well as control over time and expenses. And we will be discussing routing and scheduling, where we will see that when sales persons plan their routes and their schedules in advance, when they fix their appointments in advance, it also helps ensure that there is no time wastage of any sort. So, that is how routing, scheduling and time management becomes very, very important. Now, this brings us to the next topic, which is routing and scheduling of sales personnel. So, what is routing? Now, routing refers to the travel plan of a salesperson who has to make calls to various customers in his sales territory. Now, the objective in routing is optimization of cost, whether it is with respect to time or whether it is with respect to money. The importance of routing as well as the kind of routes that companies adopt, they will depend upon the nature of the product, it will depend upon the market potential, the competition, the type of selling efforts required, etc. So, let us go a little more into why is routing important and what are the benefits of routing. Now, routing helps reduction in travel time. Salespersons can plan their sales calls in such a manner that they would be able to avoid problems of backtracking and crisscrossing. Now, what is backtracking? Let us take there is a salesperson whose office is in Kolkata and he has to make calls all across starting from Kolkata to Bhubaneswar. So, there would be several towns and cities in between, start with Kolkata, then comes Kharagpur, then comes Balasore and Bhadrak, and then there is Cuttack, and then there is Bhubaneswar. So, he would plan his calls in such a way that he starts with Kolkata and then he moves to Kharagpur and Balasore and Bhadrak and then Cuttack and then Bhubaneswar. But backtracking will happen when he moves from Kolkata to Kharagpur and then he goes to Cuttack and then comes back to take care of Bhadrak. So, that is where he is going to spend more time travel and then he goes till another station ahead, comes back to Bhadrak, does his call and then again goes to Bhubaneswar via Cuttack. So, what he is doing is he is actually moving straight line, then suddenly going back and then going back, doing his work and then again returning and again returning to Cuttack and then going to Bhubaneswar, which would mean that instead of going, taking a route which was a straight route from Calcutta to Kharagpur to Balasore and to Bhadrak and to Cuttack and to Bhubaneswar, he has actually gone from Kolkata to Kharagpur to Balasore to Cuttack and then come back to Bhadrak, then gone back to Cuttack and then gone to Bhubaneswar. So, you see the kind of time he will be spending and the cost he would be incurring in travelling, So, that is where if plans are correct, properly routed, sales calls are correctly scheduled, this kind of a backtracking would not happen. Crisscrossing is again similar when you are moving up and down, back and forth, trying to take care of customers, actuals and prospective in the various territories, which could actually have been managed well if the sales call had been scheduled something in a more simpler fashion. So, because routing helps salespersons in reducing travel time, salespersons can also spend more time on selling and non-selling activities, and this would lead to effective and efficient coverage of the sales territories. It would save on unnecessary travel cost and other selling expenses, which generally happen because of backtracking and crisscrossing. So, routing helps salespersons perform their duties effectively. It helps in reduction of travel time. Because it helps in reducing travel time, salespeople can spend more time dealing with customers, current customers, prospective customers. They can spend more time with their dealers. So, they can spend more time on selling and non-selling activities, and routing also will help save on unnecessary travel cost and other selling expenses, which would again mean that overall selling expenses would reduce and net profits would increase. So, now, how do you set up a routing plan? So, this would actually require identifying customers in a sales territory. Now, these customers would be both your actual customers or your current customers as well as your potential or your prospective customers, and then you categorize these customers on the basis of their sales potential as high, medium and low. Now, in case it is your current customers, you would classify them as A, B and C. In case they are prospectives, you would classify them on the basis of their potential as and their prospect status as hot, warm and cold. In any case, you would be categorizing them on the basis of their sales potential, profit potential as high, medium and low. And then you determine the call frequencies as well as the time duration spent on each of these categories of customers per call. So, when you set up a routing plan, the first thing that we do is we identify customers in the sales territory. Then we categorize them on the basis of the sales potential as high, medium and low, and then you determine the call frequencies as well as the time duration per call for each of the categories of customers. Now, sales managers must have a big responsibility here while they are routing plans for their sales personnel, because they must ensure that high potential customers are given a priority and can be effectively catered to. As I just said, while assigning salespersons, the sales managers should understand that the best of salespersons must actually be catering to those who are the most profitable prospects, who are the most profitable customers, and who could be the best prospects in terms of giving business to the organization or to the company. So, the sales managers must route plans such that high potential customers are given a priority. They must assign the salespersons in such a way that the best salespersons deal with most highly potential customers, and so that the high potential customers can be effectively catered to and can give business to the company. So, it is a big responsibility on the part of the sales managers to route such plans that high potential customers are given a priority and can be effectively catered to. Now, routing patterns may vary, and some of the commonly used patterns are the straight line or the hopscotch, the circular and the clover leaf. And you see here on straight line there is this salesperson whose base is B, which is his base, and he has these different customers in these different cities or towns which he must deal with. So, he can either go to the farthest point, which is C1, and then move backwards to C2, C3, C4 and C5, which means that if the base is in Kolkata, he has to take care of territories and clients till Bhubaneswar. So, he first goes to Bhubaneswar straight away from Kolkata, and then he returns, and while on his return he stops at Cuttack and at Bhadrak and at Balasore and at Kharagpur, and then he returns to his base. So, that is what we refer to as the hopscotch pattern, and the other pattern is a straight line where he would first go from the base to C5, which is Kharagpur, and then to C4, which would be Balasore, and then C3, which would be Bhadrak, and C2, which would be Cuttack, and then C1, which would be Bhubaneswar. So, these are two formats, starting with the farthest and then returning is the hopscotch, and going one by one in a particular direction from the home base to the next, to the next, to the next, and would be the straight line. Then we have the circular pattern, and then we have the clover leaf, and as far as the circular pattern is concerned and the clover leaf is concerned, they are again little complex in nature, and we will be discussing this. The source of this particular figure is Havaldar and Kawale, Sales and Distribution Management, 3rd edition, 2017, McGraw-Hill. Now, coming to the circular pattern, as the name goes, the person moves in a circle. He starts with the home base and he makes calls around and around and around, and then he moves round and then reaches the point from where he started, and then he reports to his home base. And then we have the clover leaf, where again he starts from the base and then complete in a circular fashion. So, in the circular pattern, the salesperson moves in a circle. He starts from his base and moves in a circle, making calls to customers one by one and ending it at the base. But in the clover leaf, the first route of the salesperson will cover only a part of the sales territory. The next covers the neighboring circle or the neighboring wedge, and the next, so that all the other sales territories get covered. So, what is happening is that the routing pattern resembles a clover leaf, and hence the name a clover leaf pattern, where the first route of the salesperson covers only a part of the sales territory, the next covers the neighboring circle, and the next another, and so on till the whole sales territory can get covered. Next is scheduling. Now, scheduling refers to planning customer visits and allocating time to such visits. Sales managers play a major role in helping salespersons schedule their activities. They identify major selling and non-selling activities that salespersons must perform. They also specify the time that the salespeople must spend on these activities, and so that the salesperson's efforts can bear fruitful results. Now, Territory scheduling or time allocation requires that sales managers consider the following: the number of customers in the territory, the number of sales calls required, the frequency of the calls, the time or the duration spent on each call, time required for travel, etc. So, the time allocated for sales call to be made on customers all depends upon the type of the customer, the sales potential of the customer, ABC in the case of current customers, hot, warm and cold in the case of prospects, and the service, whether it is service selling or whether it is developmental selling, and the selling methods and the selling style required. So, with this we come to an end of this particular lecture. These are the references, and this brings us to an end of the 5th lecture on the 7th module of the course. I hope you found this lecture beneficial. Thank you.